Very rough draft. Come on up. Yep. Let me know. We are back. The state aid for school construction, Friday, September 27th. We're going to take a look at a very rough draft with some possible governance language prepared by Legislative Council. And I said this last time, it is helpful for me to hear myself say it again or find it in my notes again. But when we think about our decision points for what we're doing here, I'm coming at this assuming that we need to address kind of the same decision points, whether there's $10 or $100 million available for school construction. I think we all know there's probably not going to be like $100 million wonderfully available next year, nor are a lot of things probably shovel ready or some of the forward planning. We might need to be more strategic about some of the planning grants, and I think AOE has some feedback about. So if we can now sort of shift back into, we got a lot of numbers this morning, which I think are super helpful in terms of what's possible and also just how things work and flow. But back to the governance side of things, which is how would this work? And what do we want to make sure we include in a program as we get closer to our product, which is we don't have to write a report. We just have to have an actual bill ready for introduction. All right, thank you.
Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. Would you all like to share my screen?
Yes.
Yes. For those that are not in the room.
Yep.
So before I do that, I will just say what we are going to walk through now at whatever level you all decide is most effective and productive for today is literally spaghetti that I have thrown on the wall. Based on your last meeting and some feedback from your chairs. And I fully anticipate you will not love everything. I've got my pen and my hard copy to do markup. And I think we can go about this a couple different ways. One is there's a lot of substance here for duties and responsibilities. And I think that obviously all policy decisions for you all to make. The other piece that is not necessarily reflected in the words on the page, but we can look at some other examples in state law, is literally what are you creating? Are you just assigning duties to the Agency of Education and then letting them decide how that fluffs out? Are you creating a department within the Agency of Education? Are you creating a standalone body? Like the Green Mountain Care Board is the example I always think of. So what, all policy decisions to be made. So what I have done today is I started with the most simple option, at least from a drafting standpoint. And that is just assigning the Agency of Education specific responsibilities. So there is nothing in section 1, which is again, just responsibilities that AOE is responsible for when it comes to state aid for capital construction, that is specific as to who within the agency is doing any of this. And there's no positions added in this legislation yet, right? So do you want to just go through kind of what I've cobbled together, or do you want to have a higher level discussion of what you are creating? Are you giving AOE duties? Are you creating a more organization within AOE through statute? Are you creating a standalone body? How do you want to approach the conversation?
Well, maybe we could have a conversation about who the potentials are. Like, what are the options? What's kind of the low hanging fruit by creating a new organization just to start?
Yeah, it's a good idea. And then we can get more granular, and then we can go here.
Are you looking to me for those options?
No.
No, so how about what if Jill
Yes.
maybe puts out a position on pros and cons for the AOE?
Great idea.
Just to
I'm gonna stop sharing my screen then.
So, I mean, I would argue that this, it makes sense for this to sit within the agency. And I think two places. One is, we did this before and we had success with it. So we've got some historical kind of knowledge that we can leverage there. The second is, and it's more to me sort of philosophical and foundational, is that I think that we have a consensus that this is not simply a funding program. This is an educationally driven program. And so you could absolutely make the argument that this should sit somewhere else. But I think the risk there is that you lose the educational knowledge and prioritization, and it immediately, like it could become simply like a bonding program. And I think that we would lose the opportunity that I think they'll agree upon, which is that this construction aid can actually be a critical driving force towards the strategic priorities. So that is my sort of my pitch for why, I guess it's a pitch, my argument for why it would sort of more appropriately sit within the agency. I think also we're relying fairly heavily on the Rhode Island model, and that's where it sits there, and it makes sense to sit there. Because what they do have in that, and it's a model that I think works, is they have folks with financial expertise, which is critical, I think, to advising. They have a series of folks with a background in like educational facilities that can advise, but also be appropriate reviewers. And then they're also tied into the larger agency, so they have a strong understanding of what the priorities are. So to me, it makes sense, but I'm more interested in ultimately having a state construction aid program than, it's got to be an AOE. So very open to folks if they have a different take on it.
Alice, you go first and go. So if the agency had it, which you currently have it, basically,
We do, yeah.
you basically have it right now.
Yeah.
How would the program be different? If the agency had it, what would that program entail? Would you be promulgating rules for specifics? Would you just be overseeing the project that the individual school has, or in combination with a consolidation piece? What exactly would the program be in the agency?
Yeah, I mean,
I just need more of a context, because
Sure.
right now it's the agency has the program. State Board of Education has the standards, basically.
yes, and
So how,
I think there's actually some language in there. Beth, can I?
I made one policy choice for you all to consider, to
Yeah.
push you to this exact conversation. So in the draft that I have, here, let me just share my screen again. So, and we don't have to get as nitty gritty as we will and need to eventually get today. But so all I've done is I've added a statute to the school construction chapter in Title 16, which is chapter 123. And I've added a statute that is literally, I pulled all of AOE's responsibilities out of the current program and then put them just in a list. Because the current statute is the whole process, right? Preliminary application through to how do you get your money at the end. And so I went through and I pulled out everywhere that the agency had a responsibility and added it to the list. I also added some from Rhode Island so that you can discuss. And that's it. I did not create a new department within the agency. I did not give this draft does not give any direction for like, there has to be an executive director of this program or anything. So if this language were to pass as drafted, the agency would be responsible for carrying out all of these objectives, but then they would decide as an agency how to organize themselves best to carry that out, right? Like, all of the departments that live in AOE right now are not specified in statute. There are many state agencies where it's the opposite. where all of the departments are spelled out in statute. So it's a policy choice, but maybe to kind of get the conversation going, I'll just go through what some of those duties are. And maybe that will help inform the conversation of where the duties should live. How's that?
And then I think also, Beth, the critical piece here is the other part of what you've drafted, which is the advisory council, because those two things have to go together when we're talking about this. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're not repealing any of the current.
I will say, depending on what you decide to do, there will
This
need to
draft
be,
doesn't repeal
there will need to be conforming changes in lots of different places. But for today's conversation, all I have done is focus on governance. And that literally, to me, at this stage, meant who's responsible for what and what entity is responsible for that. And the conversation, I think you left off on AOE to start. And so that's all this is. It is not touching, this draft does not touch in any way, shape, or form the school construction program as it lives, as far as the preliminary application approval, the 30% requirement, the audit before you get your final paint, all of that still lives. You'll see there's nothing crossed out here. It's all brand new language. So we're just saying that the Agency of Education is responsible for implementing the state aid for capital construction program according to the provisions of this chapter, right? So we're going to sweep in everything that's not specifically enumerated here. The agency shall be responsible for, first thing, reviewing preliminary applications. And then I referenced section 348 is what I think Representative Emmons is referring to. That's the program, essentially, when you think about it.
Okay.
I will just note,
So,
Mhm.
just to interrupt. So reviewing, does reviewing mean prioritizing? Like,
great
I was looking for
question.
prioritizing in here.
Mm,
Right, it's under 3848,
It is, but it is not currently the agency's responsibility.
it's a state board.
So what I have before you is what is in current law.
That we should discuss. It was the state board because at the time of the program, the agency was a department under the state board. So whether or not, that's a question, it's a policy question, if that continues to make sense, where those priorities get identified, but I think that's where the advisory council comes in. So, yeah, keep going.
So you will notice that not all steps in the school construction aid program are referenced here, and that is because they are probably state board duties. And I have like a cheat sheet for myself that I'm happy to share and could put up on the website. But no, preliminary approval is just that, preliminary approval, and that is under current law.
Yeah, but it's a gate.
Correct.
Any
Yeah.
gate requires prioritizing.
Yep. And
Well, what is, this is current law.
other than subdivision 2, yes.
The 3438, approval of preliminary application. And this is what needs to be considered, regional educational opportunities and needs, including the school building capacity across school district boundaries and available infrastructure, economic efficiencies, suitability of an existing school building to meet educational needs, and statewide educational initiatives, and the strategic plan of the State Board of Education. That's what goes in current, that's what's in statute. So that's what we're saying, in number 1 here.
Correct.
Yep, do think it's a good idea. I think Megan resent us the report from last year's work. I do think it's a good idea that we all just look that over again, just because some of these things are touched in that report as well.
And I think that's the work of what we're going to be doing in the next session,
Right.
right? Is looking at a new proposed framework for how we prioritize, determine eligibility. I would say it's eligibility, prioritization, incentivizing, and then what are the strings attached, the compliance and oversight. And that's what we're going to be discussing, is all of that meat is
And-
ready to pick over.
Yeah.
So from a drafting perspective, this is a chicken or the egg situation.
Yeah.
So I anticipate almost all of this will change.
Yeah.
But this will, at least today, help you go down the path of what kind of entity, who is responsible for the program? And if it's not one entity, what are the components in current law and how, as you're thinking about how to change those, thinking about who would then be responsible for them? So preliminary application approval is currently an AOE responsibility in accordance with everything Representative Emmons just laid out, which is that reference to section 3448. Subdivision 2 is not current law. Subdivision 2 rulemaking authority currently lives with the State Board of Education. I put it here to push that conversation. I don't know that you need to make a decision now, but I do think that rulemaking is likely going to be crucial to this program. And so you will need to make a policy decision of who owns those rules. It doesn't necessarily have to be the Agency of Education or the State Board of Education. You can give your advisory board rulemaking authority. I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying you have a whole host of options. Let's see, developing a pre-qualification and review process for project delivery consultants, architecture and engineering firms. Part of this is taken out of the enabling legislation. This is a charge to AOE right now. That was put into place this year to help with the school facilities planning grant. Providing technical assistance and guidance to school districts and SUs on all phases of school capital projects. I've heard you all talk a lot about how crucial technical assistance and guidance will be to this program. You all have to live with how specific you want to get on what does that look like. So we've got technical assistance to school districts, and then we've got providing technical assistance. This is from Rhode Island. Training and education to school districts, SUs, general contractors, subcontractors, et cetera, in the planning, maintenance, and establishment of school facility space. Maintaining a current list of school construction projects that have received preliminary approval, that have received final approval, and the priority points awarded to each project. Collecting and maintaining readily available data on all public school facilities in the state.
Can you elaborate on where that came from and specifically possibly what data folks are looking for? It's pretty generic word.
So I can't because that
Do
word
that
is,
in Act 72.
yes, so there is the,
Yeah,
Which data?
the state facilities assessment data, which now sits in a database
Okay.
and has all major systems.
So it's facility,
Life building, yeah.
facilities condition.
Mhm. Yeah,
And
so
you can-
we're already, sorry, Beth, we're already required to do that in Act 72.
I get it. It's a pretty generic word.
Well, it sounds like the bond bank has a lot of data as well, which is why it might be nice to have them on the advisory board, no?
They have a piece of it. I wouldn't say any,
Okay.
they wouldn't have it on the facilities condition or anything like
Right.
that, but that's, yeah. But I think that maintaining a database of bond passage and all of that, which we've started to work with them.
Awesome.
so this language is taken directly from, in addition to all of the work that the agency has done under Act 72, which exists. This language is specifically taken from Rhode Island. Again, you all need to fine tune it to meet your goals and priorities. So if you're comfortable with telling whatever entity is responsible for collecting data, collect data, then you have to live with not being happy with what they are collecting, right? You can get more specific, or you can just say, you know what, they have the expertise. We're going to trust that they're collecting all the relevant data. Or you can go somewhere in between.
I would maybe make the argument that this is redundant with existing statute that already requires us to do work. So let's play this out in like worst case. So we are required by Act 72 to collect and maintain facilities data, which we already do, right? And we spent the last 3 years doing that. What happens if a later legislative body comes along and says, we want you to collect different data. I want to signal that that's the level of like complexity and redundancy that has gotten us into the situation where we have 1,000 different data collections all meaning different things. So I would actually make the argument for simplicity that you would strike that, or you would say, as per Act 72 of 2021.
So.
That did not.
No, I will just say, I started by saying there's going to be a lot of conforming revisions that are needed depending on what you do here. And so I would suggest that everything related to the school construction program live here, one-stop shopping. So if there is another statute that requires AOE to collect data related to facilities, perhaps we strike that. And we, make sure that everything is available, it matches what you want to do here. If Act 72, and Act 72 predates me, so I don't have an independent memory of it right now. But if Act 72 is all session law, that's, you're going to want to put it in statute. But we can, whether it lives here or somewhere else, that's part of this fine tuning markup process.
Duly noted.
Yes.
You mentioned session law, but was there a time frame for that assessment?
Yeah, it's that.
Okay.
Yep.
But now,
I know, but it goes back to the question of session law.
yeah, so as the way that we completed that work, it allows for us to maintain it in perpetuity in two ways. One, we have a database that we now have access to forever. And we also have a position, which we also didn't have. But I take the point that we may want to put that into statute.
And again, part of when we get ready to finalize drafting is my job will be to true up and make sure that there isn't that redundancy across Title 16. We're just nowhere near ready to do that yet, but I hear you. Collecting and maintaining and making publicly available quarterly progress reports. Again, this is taken from Rhode Island on ongoing school construction projects. Recommending, again, taken from Rhode Island, recommending policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing for school construction programs at both state and local levels. 10, also taken from Rhode Island, which again needs to eventually true up with the work of Act 72 and any other direction. But again, I'm going to make a pitch that it should all live here. Conducting a needs survey at least every 5 years to ascertain the capital construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and other capital needs for all public schools. And again, you could love 2 words out of this or the thought behind this. And my job going forward is to work with you to get it right. Developing a formal enrollment projection model or using projection models already available, also taken from Rhode Island. Also taken from Rhode Island, encouraging school districts and SUs to investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space in and around the district or SU. Also taken from Rhode Island, collecting and maintaining a clearinghouse of prototypical school plans that may be consulted by eligible applicants. On page 3, subdivision 14. Also taken from Rhode Island, retaining the services of consultants as necessary to effectuate the roles and responsibilities listed within this section. So a broad grant of the use of consultants. And then a reporting requirement. And again, there's a lot missing here because it's state board responsibilities. And if you want me to share my cheat sheet, I'm happy to do that.
Please do.
Yes, great.
How about the concept of repurposing schools, right? It's not necessarily an AOE issue, but it's got to be in here somewhere that whole conversation is full circle. If we take a school and we take it offline, that it's got a destiny somewhere. Again, I don't think that's an AOE responsibility, but somebody's got to keep that in their back pocket.
Yeah.
Communities will get quite upset when you just shut down a school without a future concept.
Yeah, a couple quick thoughts on that. One, I wonder about if we go the route of some sort of advisory board. if there's a voice or a perspective there that is a sort of rural revitalization voice or expertise. And then second, there's a little bit of a conflict here because this is about, if this program is, you know, renovations and building, it may be in a different way that a school ends up closing, whether it's sort of the pressure of the community and costs, whether something comes out of the commission and years from now, the agency is literally making rules, but it's a bit, there isn't necessarily, like, I guess that's a challenge here. There isn't necessarily, are we considering a universe of incentives that are for just closing something and repurposing it if it isn't educationally also about opening something or using something differently for K-12 education?
Yeah.
That gets tricky. Maybe part of this is hearing from ACCD or, I did do my homework and meet with USDA and Sarah Waring. Unfortunately, I don't have great magical news to share from that. So I hear that point and I'm struggling to see then where it fits in here. Because a school might close in a town or a community that isn't being replaced somewhere out, like, these aren't necessarily
Yeah, it's not one
I mean,
for
they
one.
are connected, certainly in our like lived experience
But the
matters,
piece may not
but
be-
they're not here. So how to do that? It also had me wondering when he was talking about the sort of P3 piece about the repurposing part, not just the physical building so much as the land that they're on. And potentially if, because a lot of buildings are in tough shape, if it's got some
Brownfields.
well, no, but if it has like wastewater, if it has some of the things that are like the biggest hindrance to building housing, is there a way to reuse some of those pieces? But I'm not sure how that
I don't know.
I wonder,
fits in here.
I wonder if that aspect can be tied more closely into the prioritization of maybe somehow, not the funding itself, but so if a school district is going to be building a new school, if they can show that they have a plan to repurpose their old facility, then maybe it works somehow in a prioritization list. I don't know. But
Yeah, I
It's a good
just-
something like
I
that.
don't think it's exclusively rural because
No, it's
Burlington
not.
has
It's not right, yeah.
two
But
middle
I-
schools, multiple
I'm not
elementary.
tying it in like that.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea.
And that puts it on the school district themselves to have.
But
Can
then I
we
also
table
think
this,
that's
though?
gonna be, yeah, I think we need to
Fine.
table it because tricky, because the school district may not know anything about housing programs and housing redevelopment, like.
Yeah.
Doing this versus that, you know,
Let's
this
table
is our
that.
silos. Okay, so the intercept and now how to turn schools into houses are in the parking lot.
Yeah, exactly. And let's talk about the advisory board.
Okay.
Great.
Yeah.
No, we're not ready for the advisory board. We're gonna look at my cheat sheet of what are current roles of the State Board of Education. And currently, this conversation you all are having about points is a state board prerogative right now. So under current law, the state board drafts the rules for the program, and that includes, and you all know what that means, right? But not limited to. So just because there's an part of the program that is not listed here, but is in rule, pay no mind to that. I'm just picking out the big topics for you. So on what is required on the preliminary application lives in state board rule. The point system, space and cost parameters, energy projects, and then the definition of significant deferred maintenance. That's all state board rulemaking. The state board is responsible for assigning the points, so the project can be placed on a priority list. The state board was going into the institutions committees during its, and then giving its annual capital construction funding request. So remember, the agency is approving preliminary applications, the state board approves final applications. But then the secretary could give good cause to start before your final. There's a lot of different roles here. And then at the very end, the state board is certifying an award for the project, the commissioner of finance who issues a warrant for half of the award. And then the secretary certifies the remainder of the award once the project is completed.
So the state board was above the department.
Yes,
What year did the department?
2012,
So that was after the moratorium.
correct.
Who is the Commissioner of Finance and Management? What,
Like, who, with their name?
no, like, what agency do they fall into?
I believe the administration.
Yeah,
Agency.
Agency of Administration.
It's Adam Cushing, right? Is it Adam? Yep. Adam Cushing, but it's under the Agency of Administration on the 5th floor. It's the-
My inclination right now, just to put ideas out there, is the sort of preliminary pieces that live in AOE, and we get some more fleshed out feedback from AOE at the October meeting. I am personally more swayed towards a new advisory council or board rather than the state board as the second set of eyes on things, the perhaps having to make some of the decisions around prioritization, incentives.
Yes, I agree.
I'm leaning towards that.
Yeah,
Kind of my,
just simpler. Among other things.
Clearly, there's, a little history here, little potential friction. Is it possible or appropriate to have the State Board of Education come in here next time
That's
and
what-
give us some time?
I think, we probably
Once
need
they get to
some
digest.
feedback from them on,
So I'm gonna be a devil's advocate.
Yeah.
Why create another board when there's already one in place? Why put up the expense of creating another board when there's one in place?
From my limited experience, the State Board of Ed has limited capacity and they are already overtasked or taxed with a lot of other things. And this advisory board that we're gonna hopefully look at here would be specific to construction. Just my 2 cents.
I would add to that because I would, like, some of the things that were so interesting to me about Rhode Island and sort of seeing some of their work feel like it requires some perspectives that aren't going to be in a state board or in an AOE. So I right now would love to see an advisory board that included the bond bank, a representative from the bond bank. Like we were just talking, perhaps somebody that has some like housing revitalization, economic development expertise. As some slightly different, I'm sure there would be some overlap with like usual players that we get when we talk about education things, but a slightly different perspective on, with a little bit more of an eye towards financial and kind of logistical things in the state, workforce, infrastructure
Infrastructure, yeah.
issues in the state, as we think about this as a sort of state program and state priorities, not just a aid to districts and then you do what you want, but this is a more state-driven
Right.
investment.
Yeah, and we can make it so that folks on the SBOE are precluded from being
Sure.
on this board.
Yeah, and maybe there's a rep from, one of the seats is somebody from
Yeah.
the State Board of Education, that seems, somebody from a CTE, somebody, I think, we can get into the list making part that's, but to me, there's some perspectives and some expertise around where I see this program potentially going that might not sit inherently at a state board or in an AOE technical.
So the advisory board will be an independent board.
Yes.
And not answer to anyone. Yeah.
That's a policy.
Let's look at what I've drafted. Let's look at what I've drafted, so you all can make that decision. So I modeled this again after what Rhode Island is doing. But there are many different examples in our state government of different administrative boards and where they sit and what their responsibilities are. So again, this is modeled after Rhode Island, so. And I will just, from a word choice standpoint, I think that term advisory board is significant. To me, that signals they don't really have any power. They are there to advise. And you'll see that throughout, again, modeled after what Rhode Island has. So we're going to create the State Aid for Capital School Construction Advisory Board, which shall advise the agency on the implementation of the program In accordance with the provisions of this chapter, we're in that chapter 123 in Title 16, including the setting of statewide priorities, criteria for project approval, and recommendations for project approval and prioritization. So membership, this is not, this is modeled after Rhode Island, but I made some choices based on who we have here. It wasn't completely analogous. So 3 members serving ex officio, the treasurer, the commissioner of BGS, and the executive director of the bond. They can be whoever you want them to be. Secretary of Education is not on here because this board is advising the Secretary of Education. You're just wondering where that important person is. Then we have 4 members of the general public. And this is really specific, and we can make it whatever you want, but I have them serving 4-year terms. 2 appointed by the Speaker of the House, 2 appointed by the Committee on Committees. You could have them be gubernatorial appointments. You could have them appointed by someone else. You are a legislative, mostly, body, so I went with that first, but you can make whatever policy choice you want there on the appointments. So each of the speaker's appointments are going to have expertise in education or construction, real estate, or finance. And one of them has to be representing a supervisory union. And then the Committee on Committees appointments have to have the same type of experience, but one of them has to be an educator. Again, that representing the supervisory union or the educator, and then that expertise is taken out of the Rhode Island law.
Can I ask a question? Would the presence of someone who's representing a supervisory union create the perception of a conflict of interest? Would that supervisory union be ineligible for aid while that person is on that committee?
I think you could,
Because if they're setting the prioritization of funds like that.
Yeah, but you could argue all of these spots will have a conflict of interest, because if you're in real estate, you're gonna want that new school in your town so that you can attract folks to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think it's a valid point, and I think that's something to just consider as we
Yeah.
go on.
Mhm.
But I don't think it's an automatic.
No, but it's something to address
Mhm.
as a real concern.
Depends on what the powers of this board are.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So here we have some just boring appointment language that we can skip over for the purposes of today. And then go right to the duties.
Mhm.
So the advisory board shall advise the agency on the following things. So project priorities. So this language, again, is taken from, it's modeled after and taken mostly from Rhode Island with some tweaks here and there for Vermont. This is all advisory. This is not, as drafted, no decision-making power, right? So advising the agency on project priorities, proposed legislation, policies and procedures designed to reduce borrowing for school construction programs, the development of that enrollment projection model, process and procedures necessary to apply for, receive, administer, and comply with the conditions and requirements of any grant, gift, or appropriation of property, services, or money, collection and maintenance of a clearinghouse of prototypical school plans, the determination of eligible cost components, and whether it's partial or fully eligible, development of a long-term vision for a statewide capital plan, collection and maintenance of data, advising districts on the use of a needs survey to ascertain those capital construction needs, and encouraging school districts and SUs to investigate opportunities for the maximum utilization of space. So really what you're seeing is just mirroring the agency's duties. And then the advisory board is advising them on that. That is, now I don't know anything about Rhode Island other than what I am reading in law, right? And as you all know, black letter law is not always how things work in the real world, right? So the way I am describing that, this is me sitting here saying this is how Rhode Island's doing it. I'm sure there's someone in Rhode Island who says, well, that's not actually how we do it.
Yeah.
But that's what their law says,
Yeah.
right? So I think from a practical standpoint, you all need to figure out what power do you want this board to have? Do you envision AOE being able to hire? AOE can consult with anyone they want at any time, right? Do you envision them being able to hire folks with some of the expertise they would get from this board? So maybe it really does need to be just advisory because AOE has the boots on the ground that can help them carry out some of these duties? Or do you see the needing to create some sort of independence in a board for decision making? And so maybe there's more power than just advisory?
Or potentially. Here's how I suspect this works in Rhode Island. I suspect that the program team creates all of these things, sends them up to the advisory board as recommendations. And then there's that's what I suspect is the actual way that this works with some input. I'm wondering if that may be a way to articulate it. So actually giving the advisory board the authority to set the priorities, but it's the agency that makes the recommendations to the advisory board on all of those lists of things, and that the advisory board approves. I think that where I see sort of the critical places where you really do need not the agency making these decisions is around the way that funds are prioritized. If there is a state share bonus, right, I think that's maybe even set by the legislature. And then ultimately the approval of the projects. So how I think that this probably works in real life in Rhode Island is that their team within their Department of Education actually does all the prioritization. This is, I think, similar to how it functioned before. They do all the prioritization and then they send the list up. And the list is sort of reviewed and approved. And then the question, Beth, I think, is who, in the previous program, it was the state board that was going to the legislature and basically saying, this is our list of projects. In this framework, who's going to the legislature and saying, this is our list of projects?
And who prioritizes those projects?
Well, I think the prioritization is baked into, like, a priori, it's baked, here's the set of priorities. And my understanding also from Rhode Island is that the legislature, I think, has shifted those priorities on like a 5-year kind of rolling basis. I think that's something to contemplate. We're kind of now pointing towards maybe the next session of our conversation.
They shifted to whom?
What was that?
Who's establishing the priority?
I think in Rhode Island, Beth, do you know, is it the advisory board?
The advisory board advises the school building authority on the project priorities for the school building authority capital fund. And the school building authority is located within their agency of education or their department of education.
Yeah, so the advisory board, I think likely again with their program team, I'm just going to call them, probably makes recommendations, like this is how we think they should be prioritized, et cetera, et cetera. I think we should dig into this a little bit more when we're talking about prioritization. I think potentially we should contemplate building in some flexibility into this program. So maybe the first, thinking about, again, if we're thinking with limited resources and a need to drive certain sort of strategic priorities, would we contemplate a program that, say, for the first 5 years, put more prioritization points on these 5 things, because those are the things that we think are most critical right now. And that the legislature might then, under the advice of the advisory council, revisit those priorities in 5 years and change those. So
I think what Jill's referring to in Rhode Island is not represented here because priorities or a state board function now. And so what the Rhode Island law says is their Department of Education is responsible for developing a project priority system based on the recommendations of the school building authority.
That's the program team, right?
Nope, that's the advisory, the advisory board. In accordance with school construction regulations for the school building authority capital fund,
Mhm.
subject to review and if necessary, to be revised on intervals not to exceed 5 years. And then the statute lists out project priorities shall include but not be limited to the following order of priorities. And then there's five topics here. So in Rhode Island, in law, it's the agency who's making the priorities and the advisory board is making those recommendations. And they have to revise that priority system at least every 5 years.
Good
Great.
start.
Yeah, that's a really good
So you want that?
high level.
Didn't say that.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I will just say from a legal perspective, I always like the law to be as clear as it can. So I would encourage you to give some thought over where these duties lie and who has the power and responsibility there. And is it transparent to the public? Who is actually driving the bus here?
Yeah, I agree. This is a little bit vague to me. What does advise mean? What happens if the agency did not take that advice? What are the implications? And then ultimately, where does the authority lie? I think critically for approving the projects, which should be as objective as possible.
And it is, so in state law right now, section 3448 says the agency shall provide preliminary approval if certain things are met.
Mhm.
Some of those certain things are spelled out in state board rule.
Yeah.
So you've got kind of a hodgepodge, but there is a shall there. There are other examples of the way boards work in state government, right? So the most extreme, and I don't mean extreme in a pejorative way, but the Green Mountain Care Board is an independent body. It's not attached to anyone. It makes its own rules. Cannabis Control Board, right? The medical board and the nursing board, they live in the Department of Health and the Office of Professional Regulation, which itself is part of the Secretary of State's office. The medical board and the nursing board, they own their own rules. They use the Department of Health or OPR staff to write those rules, but they are the ones, they have the rulemaking authority. Within AOE, there's the Professional Standards Board, which owns its own rulemaking authority. So there's various different models, right? So you could create an advisory board that's not really advisory. You could create something with a different title that has its own rulemaking authority, and you assign it duties, such as the Standards Board has the administrative assistants of AOE, and they're housed within AOE, but they make all the licensing decisions.
Yeah, and as we consider wrapping up, because it is a little bit after 2, can we go back to our original charge as this particular group, which is to make recommendations to the legislature, correct? Okay,
Yes, your deliverable is proposed legislation.
okay. So my question to this group is like, how fully baked does that need to be? Knowing that the legislature, who knows what they'll do. Yeah.
I think we should have a pretty good recipe.
Actually.
And so I think at least this level of detail, and then also that where's that rulemaking authority to address 3448.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, what would you like from us right now, Beth?
Nothing.
Okay.
Thank you for asking. No, I mean, direction either here or offline, just for your next meeting.
Great.
Our next meeting is October 22nd. And we roughly know, essentially, we're gonna pick up pretty much where we left off here, which will be, to kind of go back through this with a lot more detail from Jill's team at AOE about how they're envisioning some of the possibilities, and hopefully us hashing out a couple of the decision points that you're pointing us towards. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, I would suggest that as we get into these ideas about eligibility, prioritization, incentive, and accountability, it will actually help, I think, for us to flesh out where we want authority for certain things to lie. And who makes those decisions. So I think it can be a little bit iterative.
Yep.
Sorry, Beth.
No, but it might be helpful if we, next time we come back on the 22nd, that we've all given this some thought and we've dug into it a little bit. We've reread the report from our last group and we've, thought about who's going to be making the rules, et cetera, so that we can really get going right off the bat.
Can I just make one more pitch?
Yes.
Just because it lives in rule now, does not mean it has to continue to live in rule.
Yes.
Right.
So this is the opportunity to
Yeah.
make
I
recommendations to
agree.
your peers
Yeah.
of what you want power and control over as the legislature.
Yeah.
Because
Or not.
one or not, right? And part of
You
that
really
is,
want to be.
part of that is
Yeah,
expertise
that's-
of time, right? But if you have state priorities for our education system, you delegate part of the responsibility to create a school construction prioritization program that takes into account state right? You're delegating all of the decision-making authority over what they're gonna place value on. If you want to own that, then maybe some of your prioritization lives in statute.
I think there also has to be that balance between stability, like what can districts count on?
Yes.
And I'm a little bit scared of it being wholly in the legislature because that's a dynamic environment, right?
As a legislator,
That would be scary.
Joe, I agree with you.
Yeah, it started
Because
to sweat a little bit, Beth.
What's happening right now with all these various crises we have is me having to articulate to my wonderful constituents that I am a part-time legislator.
Yeah.
Who is really bound by this schedule that we have that begins in January and ends in May. We work 4 days a week. Like, I agree with you. I think we're shackled by a lot of things, but one of them is simply by the schedule that we have.
I do think that a cyclical review and evaluation, though,
Yes.
that is, maybe generated by the agency program team, goes up to an advisory council who then brings recommendations to the legislature. That feels maybe more like everyone has a say, but there's some stability in planning. It makes me scared to think about revisiting prioritization efforts because these projects take years to develop, and I would hate to take
But the other
the
thing to
outcome
think
under a
about,
district that's done everything we've asked them to do just 5 years
the other
ago.
thing to think about though is like, is AOE gonna need FTE to be able to do this work?
I think we have a model in another state that we can take a look at.
I think we wanna also, wherever the projects are and whatever the money is, we take the politics out of it. That's what was happening.
Right.
Was happening was it was dependent what party was in power,
Yeah.
where those projects, school projects were, and
Yes.
who was sitting on those respective committees, and it got nasty.
We do not want to have, I don't
And
want
you don't want
to be part of a
right.
school
I
project.
don't want any of
committee
that,
Really good point.
And earmark.
you don't want any of
Yeah.
that,
No,
because then things get shifted
Yeah.
around real fast. And they're done that.
Hmm.
That's why we had the moratorium.
all right. Wow.
Okay.